With great power comes great responsibility.
Compromise where you can. Where you can't, don't. Even if everyone is telling you that something wrong is something right, even if the whole world is telling you to move, it is your duty to plant yourself like a tree, look them in the eye and say, no, you move.
Never step onto the battlefield of ideas unprepared. Before you enter the fray, you need a plan. And there's no better place to get one than right here on Tactics with host Caleb Colquitt. The Situation Room goes live now on News Radio 1440.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Tactics. For all you tacticians out there, we appreciate you joining us today via Facebook, Twitch, Twitter, YouTube, Periscope, however you're joining us. We certainly do appreciate you making us a part of your day, and so because of that, we don't want to waste any of your time. We'll go ahead and get into the burning news of the day. Now, you may have noticed there was no show yesterday. That's because yesterday was a state holiday. It's Confederate Memorial Day, and we're actually going to talk a little bit about that and about some of the social ramifications and some of the history of that a little bit later in the show. But right now, we do have something that is far more pressing and far more important to discuss that we have not had a chance to do yet. The attacks that happened on Easter Sunday in Sri Lanka were incredibly jarring. And one of the things that I wanted to mention is that we do have an update, and unfortunately this thing continues to keep climbing. Part of this may be because Sri Lanka is not nearly as developed as the United States, and part of it is because of the sheer numbers. When you're dealing with larger numbers, getting an exact total is much more difficult, but unfortunately the death toll has risen yet again just today. In fact, I was preparing and doing a little research on this event yesterday since I had the day off and got some of my show prepared a little bit early, and it turns out that I had to re-look at all these figures because they continue to change, and unfortunately the death toll in the Sri Lanka church bombings has been raised to roughly 320, and they have at least 500 injured. And it's important to note here that even though the death toll, as horrific and catastrophic as it is already, and sadly it could continue to grow, a lot of these injuries are not something to sneeze at. And I don't know why exactly, but Americans tend to think of the injured as something that's not that big a deal because they are still alive, which thank God they are. I'm not saying that that's not something to be grateful for, but you have to keep in mind, especially with terror attacks of this nature, a lot of these injuries are not something that they're ever going to recover from and have a normal life again. Now, there's going to be some people that got away with some scrapes and bruises, and that of course counts as an injury, but just remember that injury encompasses a wide variety of people that were hurt. There are probably some people that had nothing more than a few scrapes and bruises and maybe some hearing loss, but there's also a pretty significant amount of that number that have limbs that are no longer there, that are not going to be able to do a lot of the things that they previously did, that may have had something happen to their eyes or something that dulled their senses and damaged them permanently. There's a lot of different things that could have been caused by these attacks. And so as horrible as it is for the families that lost loved ones, I don't think that it's wise for us to just sort of brush off or not really consider the impact of these injuries as well. And part of that may have a lot to do with, in America, our medical and healthcare system is so good that because we get to these people very early, our infrastructure is able to get them to medical care very quickly, even in disaster situations. A lot of these people do wind up going on to have normal lives and are able to get some semblance of normalcy in attacks like this. And it's not that there are never cases like what we're talking about, severely debilitating injuries in America, but by and large, that's one of the things that we think about when we see these stories on the news of people that were injured in attacks like this. When we see these injuries take place, it's not that way in other countries, especially in a country that, I don't know if technically Sri Lanka qualifies as third world. I believe it actually does, but I'm not exactly 100% sure about that. I think they're one of these countries that would be classified as developing countries. So not necessarily completely third world, but also not really first world. I believe that that's the classification for Sri Lanka. but they don't have that infrastructure in place, and they certainly don't have the medical capabilities that the United States has. And because of that, a lot of these injuries that are going to be taking place that they're going to have to treat are going to be far more severe and far more costly to these people than if they had been in the United States. And so that's another thing to consider with this story. So 320 dead and 500 injured. Those 500 people, a lot of them have severely had their life shaken up in a way that it probably will never be the same again for a lot of them. And so it is important that we continue to pray for them, pray for those that were injured. And of course, this was an attack on churches propagated by Muslim terrorists. This is in no way something to do political commentary. You guys know that I don't do political commentary on terror attacks or any kind of travesty for that matter, be it storms or anything else. When there's a tragedy and there's bodies on the ground, I typically make it a point to wait at least 48 hours before giving political commentary on it. Talk about the facts of the case all day, but I don't want to actually get into any of my opinion or speculation or anything like that until at least 48 hours after the event has taken place. And I think that that's sort of a sign of respect for the families there. So tomorrow, there will be some commentary on it. I've actually already got several segments planned for this. I've already got some of my research together, so be sure to check back tomorrow for that. I'm going to be giving some of my opinions, but because it helps keep me out of trouble. In other words, I'm not so impassioned and I'm not so worked up and I don't react emotionally to it. It takes some of the emotional sting that can kind of blind you to the facts if you wait a little bit. And it also helps keep speculation out of the way. If we're just dealing with the facts of the matter, you don't veer off into conspiracy land. And so check back tomorrow for my political commentary. But today, all we're going to be talking about are the facts of the case. But this was a coordinated series of suicide bombings by a radical Muslim group. It's very clear, very evident based on the evidence that we have and the way that these attacks coincided, that these people were all working together, that this had been planned for some time. This wasn't a spur of the moment thing. There was, on their side, infrastructure in place. There was a plan in place. This was well coordinated, well timed. There was a large plurality of people working with this. There have already been several arrests because there were only 6 bombers. And of course, they weren't arrested because they were suicide bombers. They're no longer alive. But there were 24 people arrested in the attack. Now, maybe some of these people, and I'm not real familiar with Sri Lanka law, as you can imagine, what's probably going on here is that there are several people that are suspected and they've just sort of arrested a bunch of them, thinking that just because they're a suspect, they need to bring them in for questioning or whatever. That may be something that's going on here. I personally don't know, but I would imagine it's actually probably a little bit less than 24, but it could be 24. And so what's probably going on here is that number of people being arrested is going to go down, and some of them are probably going to be found to not have a connection to it. But the point is, there were a lot more than these 6 bombers that were involved in this. A lot more. And we're going to continue to look into details on that. And the attack locations were 3 different churches, 3 different hotels with 8 explosions total. So 6 suicide bombers and then 2 other explosions remotely detonated. By the way, law enforcement found several different detonators at these scenes. And so there's a good chance that this could have been much worse. And so hopefully there was something to that. Hopefully some of these detonators were planned to go off and didn't. And because of that, there were some live saves for whatever reason, whether it's law enforcement or they just had technical issues, whatever it may be. There were a lot of unused detonators at a couple of these sites, and we're hoping that that means that even though this could have been worse, even worse than it already is, as horrific as it already is, maybe that is in some way God showing his providence and sort of scaling back at least some of the devastation. Let's also remember, too, that this is the second largest terror attack since 9/11. Now, obviously, America is going to remember that more vividly because it was more people and it happened on our own soil. This was a massive terror attack, huge in scale. And it's really kind of surprising that it takes place in Sri Lanka, because it would still be horrible and lives lost anywhere are still lives lost. So the location of the terror attack really doesn't matter in the terms of if you had the exact same amount of people dying in the Middle East with a church bombing, it would still be a horrible event. But the fact that it is in Sri Lanka is a little more surprising. This is not an area necessarily known for terrorism per se. And so because of that, this is something that's very jarring for the Sri Lanka people. There were 2 victims that were Americans, and 1 American, so far as we know, is still missing. I could not find an update on that because that report is a couple days old, so it may be expired, but I couldn't find any updates on that with our news partners at CNN. But FBI and Interpol are currently working the case as well, so this has become an international thing. There are international law enforcement bodies that are currently working on this with local officials. And it's something worthy of note that even though this one got a lot more press because of the sheer magnitude of it, Easter attacks on churches happen pretty much every year. It's very rare that a year will go by where there's not a significant Easter attack going on somewhere in the world. You'll remember that I think it was either last year or the year before last, there were all those really big bombings in Syria. There was one in Afghanistan last year. It's not uncommon for these attacks to take place, unfortunately. And it really is sad. It really is horrible that this is taking place, but unfortunately, Easter attacks are not something that are really that uncommon. People kind of wait for them. And when you're talking about Muslim terrorism, typically your busiest times of the year are in, I forget what their festival's name is, Rosh Hashanah or something like that. That one's really big for it. Terror attacks tend to tick up at that time, and they also tend to tick up right around the time that Easter is going. And so, as horrible as it is to think that we even have to think about this, there's sort of a terror season. And these attacks, of course, can happen anywhere at any time, but you can also specifically trace them back to certain times of the year that Muslim extremists like to perpetuate attacks like this. And really what this all boils down to is I would encourage everybody to pray for those in Sri Lanka that are affected by this and pray for Christians at large. Because in America, it's so easy for us to take our freedoms for granted. And it's not that we don't have any persecution, and it's not that there aren't terrible things that we have to deal with because of our faith. That is certainly true. You can use the analogy of just a couple years ago, well, actually, it just recently got dropped, but the Masterpiece Cake Shop thing where they had the guy that was being harassed for not making a cake for a gay couple, and that wound up going all the way to the Supreme Court. You also have occasions where you will have other Christians being persecuted. The bakery out in Oregon, the family that owns the little bed and breakfast in New York. We have the county clerk in Kentucky. Yes, harassment and discrimination because of religion, because of Christianity, because people profess the faith. It does happen in America. But I think that we take for granted sometimes how good we have it here comparatively. Because even though attacks on churches do happen in the United States, you may remember the Southland, Texas, the attack there that killed 50 people in a church, and this guy was presumably trying to go out and kill more people in a church. We have the attack by the white supremacist in South Carolina, the one at the Emmanuel Church. So yes, attacks do happen on churches in the United States, but they're really not that frequent. They are major news events when they happen here. And like I tell people that when they're talking about the news and they talk about one event that it's so outrageous that it happens, and I try to add a little bit perspective sometimes, and I'm not saying that their anger isn't justified, especially when we're talking about an attack like this where people died, but I do try to give them a little bit of context and perspective here to remember if it happens in the news, then it's unusual, because something that is mundane is not news by definition. And so if it happens all the time, then you're not going to see it on a news broadcast. And so, yes, the attacks on churches in South Carolina and in Texas, or even Jewish attacks on the synagogue that we had this past year, Or you could even look at attacks on the Christmas celebration in San Bernardino, California. All of these things, this religious persecution where people have died simply for professing their faith in Christ, those do happen, but they're exceedingly rare compared to certain parts of the world. Let's remember that in certain parts of the world, not only are Christians being persecuted for being Christian, I mean, this happens all the time in the Middle East, but there are also countries like Ukraine that I've been to where you can be persecuted for being the wrong kind of Christian, where there are not necessarily rules against being a different religion, but if you get beat up and your family gets beat up and threatened, the cops kind of look the other way because it was because you weren't the right kind of Christian. These kinds of things do happen. And they really don't in America. Not commonly. And so I do think that it ought to be a sobering reminder to us that when it's time for us to wake up on Sunday and go to church and worship, and we do so in a air-conditioned building with nice padded pews, and there's a PowerPoint projector and a sound system so that everybody can hear the preacher, and for those that have hearing difficulty, they have transmitters with headphones so you can hear. Let's remember that we have brothers and sisters around the world that are literally putting life and limb on the line every single time they walk into a church building. Now, these events are relatively uncommon. I mean, it doesn't happen every Sunday per se, but especially if this is something that has happened several times a year, and I mean every 2 or 3 weeks in some countries, once a month maybe. If that happens in your country and you're still going to worship because it's that important to you, shouldn't we as Americans that very, very rarely have to worry about anybody trying to hurt us or trying to do physical harm to us or our families by going to worship, shouldn't that instill in us not only a sense of gratitude, but some perspective and help us to remember that, you know, when we may not necessarily want to go to worship or we feel tired and we'd rather sleep in, remember that we have brothers and sisters in other countries that are literally risking their lives driving much further and not going to comfortable buildings with all the amenities that we're accustomed to. And that should not only enshrine some gratitude, but also some humility and a sense of urgency within us. It is a wonderful thing to gather with God's children and be able to worship Him together as a church family. And we really should remember that this is an opportunity that we have that is far better in many ways than some of the congregations that we have around the world. Now, does it make the worship better? I don't know necessarily. In fact, I know for a fact you can't say it makes it better. I don't think that God thinks that it's better just because you have a nice building and you have a sound system where everybody can hear the preacher. I'm sure that some of the best worship that God's ever had is in times of great persecution, probably in the early church under Rome. And so because of that, I do think that it should at least grant us a little perspective in the way that we think about and the way that we treat worship on Sunday, Sunday morning, Sunday night, and Wednesday night. That while some of us forego the opportunity to worship, that there are people that would give anything to be able to worship in the ease and comfort and the freedom from the fear that most Christians in other countries have to experience. Now, according to the Agent France Press, Agents, I think that's how to say it. I have no idea. French words. I don't do well with the French language. But anyway, according to a French newspaper, we'll say it that way, police already knew that an attack would happen. And this is a quote taken directly from their newspaper. Quote, documents seen by the AFP show that Sri Lanka's police chief, I'm not even going to try to pronounce that name, issued an intelligence alert on top of officers 10 days ago, which, by the way, if you're looking at the time of this being pinned, that would make that April 11th is when they found out about this, warning that suicide bombers plan to hit, quote, prominent churches. So the police chief in the local area was already aware 10 days before the attack that there were Muslim groups organizing and conspiring to hit churches. Not necessarily sure how, doesn't say anything about which churches, but he knows that there are going to be suicide bombers based on these documents, that there is at least the threat of suicide bombers hitting churches. And it just astounds me that there was not extra security or some kind of consideration seemingly put into place to help deal with this threat. And it continues on a little bit later. A foreign intelligence agency has reported that the NTJ, that's the National Tawhid Jamal, is planning to carry out suicide attacks targeting prominent churches, as well as the Indian High Commission in Colombo, the alert said. The NTJ is a radical Muslim group of Sri Lanka that is linked last year to the vandalization of Buddhist statues. So again, we have confirmed now that the people that perpetrated this attack were part of a specific Muslim terrorist group that has a history of doing this in the past, and that the police chief actually knew about this, knew which group was planning it, knew that they were planning on doing it with suicide bombers, and knew that they were going to target churches. Didn't know necessarily which churches, but keep in mind that it's not like it is here in America. Sri Lanka's population is overwhelmingly Buddhist. Christians are a small minority part of the population, and Muslims make up roughly about the same. Not exactly the same, but pretty much the same portion of the population. Sri Lanka is overwhelmingly Buddhist, and so there's not that many churches to guard. And so it just is absolutely astounding that there were not extra security precautions put in place specifically for this Easter Sunday, where they knew for a fact there was a good chance of these bombings take place. They knew that there was a good chance of that coming to pass. And evidently these threats were not properly relayed to the Prime Minister. That's one thing that another news outlet had reported, that they knew about it, yes, but the police chief had not notified the Prime Minister, and somehow there's not like a proper line of communication, at least from a legal perspective. I believe if that's going on, I let somebody know, even if I'm just a private citizen. Even if I wasn't a police chief and I got credible evidence of a threat, I believe I'd be letting the proper authorities know. And another thing, he is the police chief. Are we really to believe this guy couldn't have acted on his own? I mean, maybe Sri Lanka has some kind of weird law where the police chief can't order people to go to a certain place, but I find that pretty hard to swallow. I mean, not to do a whole lot of comparison, but it seems to me that there were quite a few failings on law enforcement's part, and it kind of reminds me of Sheriff Israel in the Parkland shooting fiasco, and that there was not proper security measures put there. But I will say, at least in his case, he didn't know that the attack was coming. He knew that the person that was targeting that school was volatile, and that there was good reason to believe he may commit a school shooting. But it seems as though there was some kind of miscommunication between the police chief and the Prime Minister, and because of that, proper security measures were not taken. It is really, really sad to see human incompetence be part of the formula that allowed this attack to take place, or at the very least, this death toll to be as high as it was. And it just seems like a massive failing on their part for that. So we will keep you in touch we'll keep in touch and try to make sure that we get the details of this right. If there are any more details that come to pass, we'll try to share them on the show. Like I said, I'm going to be doing a little bit of this tomorrow, because I'm also going to add some of my opinion, some political commentary, without just giving you the raw facts as I've just done. But as you know, that I do have that 48-hour rule, and so I'm going to hold off on giving my full opinions and talking about some of the political fallout, the political implications, until tomorrow. And if there was one takeaway that I wanted you to remember from this, it's just the best thing that you can do right now is to pray for these families and pray for the healing of those left behind and those that are injured. And just, if there is any good that can come from this, and it is a constant theme throughout the scripture, that God uses some of the worst travesties in the history of mankind to bring about the greatest good. And that ultimately came to pass in its truest form, in the form of his son, a perfect man dying for crimes he did not commit, and being tortured to death as a result of it. That is a running theme that goes throughout the scripture. And so if there is something good to be said, if there is something good that could come out of this horrific and terrible, unimaginable situation, it's that let it serve as a wake-up call to us. Let us as Christians, as the body of Christ, use this as a way to fortify our faith and to remember that, especially here in America, we've got it pretty good. And because of that, we ought to act in a manner that reflects that. And by that, I mean gratitude and humble submission. So if you are finding it difficult to really live out your faith, just remember that there are Christians in the world that have it much, much harder than you. And that ought to enshrine in us a sense of wonder at all the good that our Father has done for us and the benefits that he has given to us, all the advantages that we have in this country, that we should be grateful for, and that we should use that to the fullest extent by worshiping him every single day. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to go to a break real quick, and we'll be back in just a minute.
And now for a reading from the Social Justice Warrior Bible with Pastor Gregory Post.
Welcome in. I'm Gregory Post, head pastor at the Eternal Living Word Trans-Denominational Community Church and Coffee House in Novato, California. Now it's time for a reading from the SJW Bible. Today's reading will come from Leviticus chapter 10, verses 1 through 10. Now Nadab and Abihu, the sons of Aaron, took their respective fire pans, and after putting the fire in them, placed incense on it and offered strange fire before the Lord, which he had not commanded them. And the fire came out of the presence of the Lord, which created a wicked cool light show for them to see, and totally got everyone feeling the Spirit's presence. Then Moses said to Aaron, "It is what the Lord spoke, saying, even though I didn't command you to use this strange fire, I totally understand your need to express yourselves in worship and keep yourselves entertained." So Aaron therefore danced and yelled with joy, knowing that his sons were having a good time at worship. Moses called out to Mishael and Ezaphan, and the son of Aaron's uncle Uzziel, and said to them, "Come forward, carry your relatives away in front of the sanctuary outside of the camp, for they have fainted from being overwhelmed by the power of God's coolness." So they came forward and carried them still in their tunics outside the camp, as Moses had said. Then Moses said to Aaron and his sons Eleazar and Ithamar, "Do not uncover your heads, nor tear your clothes, because God wants us to always be happy, and as long as we're happy, he's happy. Therefore, if worship doesn't give you an overwhelming sense of euphoria, you need to find another congregation, preferably one with a more dynamic pastor and band." So they did according to the word of Moses. And the Lord spoke to Aaron, saying, "Do not drink wine or strong drink, neither you nor your sons with you, when you come into the sanctuary, so that you will be able to drink more once you arrive. It is a perpetual statute throughout your generations. And so as to make a distinction between the holy and the profane, between the unclean and the clean, because when worship stops being fun or feels judgy, then it becomes profane and unclean." Wow, so inspiring. This has been a reading from the SJW Bible, and remember, the only truth that matters is your truth.
And welcome back. Thank you so much for being with us. Now, I did want to mention this because, as you noticed, we did not have a show yesterday, and the reason for that was it is Confederate Memorial Day, which is a state holiday. And I really thought that this would be a good opportunity to just do a little self-reflection here. And when it comes to Confederate Memorial Day, it is observed by Alabama, Florida, and Georgia, and then Mississippi and South Carolina also kind of have their own versions of it, but it occurs on a different date. I'm not sure exactly why that is, but it's something that they've just done for a long time now. And usually when this comes up, every year there are going to be some people sort of in the political sphere that ask questions about the legitimacy of Confederate Memorial Day and ask if we really should celebrate it or not. And I don't think that it's a altogether unfair question because, as a general rule, I'm inquisitive. I like asking and answering tough questions, and that's kind of the boat that I find myself in right now. So the reason that I bring that up is I think that it's good to sort of dig into the merits of whether or not this really is something that we ought to be observing, or whether or not it's something that we can kind of say it's sort of an old, outdated tradition and needs to be thrown to the side. And so I know that you probably already have a strong opinion on this before I even get started. So I'm just going to ask you to, for a second, just kind of throw that preconceived notion away. And that's typically a good idea for any exercise in critical thinking. Just try to remove as much bias as possible. You can never completely remove it because you're a human being, but let's just remove it for a second and then ask some questions about the history, the context, what people mean by celebrating it, that sort of thing. And then I think that'll give us a better starting point to really consider this question. And there's a couple different opinions that I'm going to go over because of this, but it actually was the original Memorial Day. A lot of people don't realize this, but Memorial Day, and I'm talking about the federal holiday, not the state holiday that we celebrated yesterday. The federal holiday of Memorial Day actually started as Confederate Memorial Day, or as it was originally known, Decoration Day. So what would happen is that ladies, typically family members of fallen soldiers in the Confederacy, and this happened not long after the Civil War, would pick out a specific day. And this is part of the reason that it's different in different states, is because there was not really a consensus. It was just sort of done culturally by the communities, and a day was sort of decided community by community, and then it was later adopted by the states. But each of these ladies would go and decorate the graves of Confederate soldiers. And there's a couple things that is really important to keep in mind, regardless of how you feel about the Civil War, regardless of how you feel about all the connotations with slavery and everything else that go into it. Take all that out just for a second and remember that in their mind, their husbands or grandfathers or brothers were people that were worthy of honor, and that's the reason that they went and decorated these graves. Doesn't necessarily mean that it's a practice that we continue today. I'm just saying that you have to remember, to fully understand the context and the history of this, you need to remember that that was something that they did as a way to honor their relatives that went out and fought to defend their homeland, defend their country, at least in their own mind. And that was something that they did as a way to respect them and their sacrifice. So that's how it originally started. And then later on, I think it was in the 1970s, Memorial Day was actually instituted, and it sort of was a spin-off of this idea specifically for Confederate soldiers, and of course at the federal level was broadened to American soldiers as a whole. And so there is a difference there. There is a change there, that it was just sort of all soldiers that died in any war, any American veteran that gave his life in the service of his country. That's what Memorial Day came for. And that's another important distinction, because a lot of people really confuse Memorial Day with Veterans Day. All veterans are not the ones that are to be honored on Memorial Day. It's specifically the ones that died in service to their country. Now, we honor veterans too. That's an important day as well, and they serve just like everybody else. But Memorial Day is specifically to honor those that fell in the line of duty. And that's kind of what Decoration Day was for as well. That was sort of the original intent behind that, just specifically for Confederate soldiers. And this makes sense because the war was fought very differently in the Civil War. Because you have to remember, the Army infrastructure was not what it is now, and transportation was not then what it is now. People were riding in horses, and so what generally happened, especially because the Confederacy was kind of thrown together at the last minute, so this was really true on both sides, but it was especially true on the Confederate side, that if there was a regiment or a battalion that got wiped out, it didn't just wipe out the battalion or the regiment, and these people were coming from different locations in the case of recent history coming from all over the United States, a good example is you can remember there's sort of a joke in the Vietnam scene in Forrest Gump that he says all these different people who are named after states were from different states than the ones they were named after. Like Tex, he was from Montana. Montana, he was from California, and all this other stuff. But that's kind of the way it is in the more modern army that we're used to. It wasn't that way in the Civil War. There were towns that were devastated and literally became ghost towns because all the men in the community would die if a battalion was just wiped out. So you didn't just lose a person from a town, you could have lost basically every able-bodied man in your city, in your township, when a specific battalion went into battle first or something and got wiped out by the enemy. And like I said, this was true for both sides, but it was even more true for the Confederacy because their army infrastructure was not quite as sophisticated as the North's, because they had to throw it all together and they had to restructure the whole thing while the war was going on. And so even though it was surprisingly sophisticated for the way it was thrown together and the haste in which it was done, they still didn't have a lot of variety in the location that people came from. So when you went out into battle, you were fighting with your neighbor and your cousin and your brother. Imagine that. Because there were a lot of families, and this is a time where families didn't move off the way that they used to, that if a battalion from your town got wiped out, a lot of people would have lost all their brothers, their father, maybe even a grandfather, their cousins. Imagine that if every able-bodied man that you know today was just gone. It was not an uncommon occurrence, and that's part of the reason that it was so devastating. Keep in mind that to this day, even counting World War I and World War II, that proportional to the population, obviously there were more people in World War I and World War II, but we were also a bigger country by that point. But if you're looking proportionately to the population, the Civil War continues to this day to be the deadliest war in American history. And that's because both sides were Americans. And so because of that, this was something that really devastated towns, really devastated large portions of the South, because the vast majority of the war was fought on Southern soil. And so there were whole towns that were wiped out, businesses that were gone completely belly up, whole towns that all their men were gone and they had to either move or figure out something else. And that's part of the reason that because of this great loss, because of this great tragedy, and because of the sacrifice that went into that, this was the reason that they decided to have a day that they honored the graves of Confederate soldiers. Now, in 1868, President Andrew Johnson officially pardoned Confederate soldiers. And it's also important to note that in 1958, Congress passed Public Law 810, which granted the same protections to Confederate soldiers as American soldiers. Now, there is a fine distinction here that I want to make. Technically, this is sort of a rumor that's been going around the internet. Technically, what that law does is it never actually names Confederate soldiers as veterans. So technically speaking, there's not a legal precedent in that law for Confederate soldiers being veterans. Now, I don't see a problem with them being declared veterans, but what it does do is it gives them certain rights when it comes to their graves and the way that they ought not be disturbed, and there are certain privileges that are granted to Confederate soldiers that are also afforded to veterans that fought on the American side, the Union side, and other veterans in other wars. And so there is certainly a greater status than a civilian grave that is placed on there, and there are certain federal protections for the graves of Confederate soldiers that were enshrined in 1958. But let us also remember that on the technical side, it's not really technically correct to refer to them as veterans, American veterans. They got some of the benefits of veterans, but they weren't given quote-unquote veteran status. I know that that's a nitpicky distinction, but just so that you don't look bad in a debate or when you're discussing this topic with somebody, remember that that's something that is technically not true. It's got a hint of truth to it, but it's not actually true. So it's important for us to be distinct in this. And another thing that you need to know about the history is that they were also granted benefits for their widows in 1958. So the same benefits that were afforded to veterans of other wars, people that had died in the line of duty, soldiers that had died, their widows that were left behind got benefits. That was also true of Confederate soldiers at this time in 1958. Now, granted, by the time 1958 actually came around, there were very few left, but the point is they were given those benefits that were typically only afforded to American veterans. So I'm not trying to be nitpicky. I'm just saying that there is a distinction there that everybody that is talking about this issue needs to be aware of. It's pretty accurate to say that they are veterans, but it's not completely accurate, and it's not technically accurate. So just remember that if you're ever discussing this with somebody. So that really brings us to, now that you understand a lot more about the history and the context in which this tradition really formed, the question remains, is it appropriate to celebrate Memorial Day? Or, sorry, Confederate Memorial Day? Is it right for the state of Alabama to make this carve out for a day specifically to honor the fallen of the Confederacy? So there's a couple things I think we need to consider. First of all, I don't think that it's any less appropriate than Memorial Day. Because one thing that is true on Memorial Day, even if you disagree with the war itself or the terms of the war or some of the practices done in the war, it doesn't change the fact that a lot of the soldiers that are being honored were good people, and you were not honoring any of their incorrect beliefs or illegitimate beliefs. What you were honoring specifically is the sacrifice, the patriotism, the way that they were willing to lay their life on the line for a cause that they saw as just. And that's something that I want to dig into here, because most of the people, not all, but most of the people that fought on the Confederate side never owned a slave. And there were even quite a few people on the Confederate side that thought that slavery was not right. They believed it was wrong, but they also believed that it was important for them to defend their country. They saw it as more of a fight for states' rights. Whether or not you see it that way or not, it's important to realize that they saw it that way in many regards. Obviously, there were some that didn't. Obviously, there were some that wanted to defend slavery, but there was a large portion of them that had no reason, no motive to fight in favor of slavery. Whether or not you see the Civil War as a fight to preserve slavery, the point is many of these people that are being honored on Confederate Memorial Day, they didn't. They saw it as defending their homeland, defending their family, defending the rights of their states to make certain provisions. Like I said, in some cases that included slavery. And I think you could even make a fair argument that slavery was not only a big issue, but even the primary issue. I mean, if you ever read the Confederate Constitution, it makes it very clear that you're not even allowed to pass a law at the state level, to impede slavery. Not abolish slavery, just impede it. That was illegal. And it does put a pretty big block in the way of this argument that the Confederacy was only about states' rights. And the reason for that is, well, if you really believe in states' rights, if you really believe the states ought to be completely autonomous and operate within their own purview, which is, by the way, a sentiment that is not too far from my ideal version of federalism, and so I sympathize with that cause, it's hard for me to really go along with and say that the Confederacy was only about states' rights when one of the laws actually written into their Constitution and enshrined in it was that the states are not allowed to make laws that even somewhat impede slavery, that even somewhat make it more difficult to engage in. And it included the aspect of race in there. It said specifically, and I'm just using the term that they used, don't freak out on me, don't demonetize this video. They specifically used the term Negroes, and I'm only saying that because it is the word that they used in that Constitution. So when they said that, specifically the enslavement of black people is something that was not allowed to even be impeded by law in the Confederate Constitution. And that Constitution also states, it refers to itself as the Constitution of the slave-bearing Confederate States. So yeah, slavery was a huge part of the Civil War. I'm just saying that there were a lot of soldiers that they didn't see it that way. Or at least, even if they thought that preserving slavery was a right or preserving slavery was something that was going to be an effect of that war, it was not the primary reason that they were willing to give their lives in service to their home state. And actually, a great example of that is General Robert E. Lee. And I want you to think about this for a second. Robert E. Lee was an abolitionist. We know that from his personal writings. Now, he was what is referred to as a gradual abolitionist, which, by the way, was also the position of President Lincoln. He believed that slavery should be abolished, but it should be done gradually and not altogether. Obviously, he changed his belief by the time he got into office, and he changed his belief with the Gettysburg Address, the Emancipation Proclamation. I said the Gettysburg Address, specifically the Emancipation Proclamation, and then later, of course, slavery was abolished in all of the states with the 13th Amendment. But my point is, Lee's position on slavery was not too different from Abraham Lincoln's position on slavery, even when he entered into the White House. He believed it should be gotten rid of. He believed it was a moral evil. He just believed that it should be sort of gradually phased out. And despite this, when he got word, and this is somebody that lives extremely close to Washington, the reason that Arlington Cemetery houses Robert E. Lee's corpse is because it's his backyard. That was his land. That's how close he is to D.C. So he was very near the Union Capitol. That's where his homestead was. But this is a guy who, when it came down to it, when Virginia seceded, he was actually intending to side with the North. But when Virginia left the Union, he couldn't do it. And I want you to put yourself in his mindset just for a moment. Robert E. Lee had to make a choice. He could either side with his country that he had served honorably for a number of years, or he could side with the Confederacy and his home state of Virginia, which had just seceded from the Union. If he had joined the Union, and he had the option to, had he joined the Union, he would have had to have led campaigns that very likely would have killed his friends, his neighbors, his fellow Virginians, and his own family. Can you imagine what that would have done to somebody? That if you were a general leading an attack, leading an army, and your job is to make as good a strategy as you can to win the battle and kill as many of the people on the other side as humanly possible, because that's what a battle is. Imagine if one of his sons or nephews or cousins had died in a battle like that. Can you imagine what that would have done to him? Because he would have been at least partially responsible for the death of his own family members. Now, maybe you can look back and with hindsight say that Robert E. Lee should have stuck to the Union, and he should have really foreseen that there was a pro-slavery agenda with the Confederacy, and so he should have never supported that. But it's also important to remember that that was the choice that he was facing. And when you think about it like that, it does put it into a different light. It does put it into a different context. And I do think that the context here is important. Now, there were white supremacists on the Confederate side. I think if you look at the personal writings of Jefferson Davis, who was the president of the Confederacy, resided right here in Montgomery while the capital of the Confederacy was here, there's no doubt in my mind, based on several of his writings and several of his speeches, both he and his vice president were incredibly racist, very, very much in support of white supremacy, and very pro-slavery. Part of the reason that they were instrumental in crafting the Constitution of the Confederacy. So I don't think that you could make the case that they were people that ought to be honored and upheld. And honestly, it makes me a little uncomfortable when people try to rush to their defense, considering some of the stances that they took. And for some people on the Confederacy like them, I do believe that they saw the Civil War as a war, at least primarily, to preserve slavery. But the important thing to remember is that when we honor people on Confederate Memorial Day, that a vast majority of those people did not. A lot of them, most of them, were more like General Lee, who they saw slavery as something that was kind of a part of the war, but it certainly wasn't their motivation for doing what they did. It certainly wasn't their motivation for showing the patriotism and valor that they did, trying to preserve what they saw as something that would secure their future and their family's future and the future of their homeland, the future of their state. I'm just saying that it's something to consider. So with that, you do reach, I think, what is a kind of difficult decision on whether or not to continue to celebrate something like Confederate Memorial Day. And one of the things that I wanted to bring up here is that some Confederate traditions sort of came about in the 1960s. One of those was, for example, putting the Confederate flag, or the rebel flag. It actually is the rebel flag. The Confederate flag was a different one. The one that you're familiar with, the stars and bars. The one that you see on all the Sons of the Confederacy shirts. Those ones. So one of the traditions that sort of cropped up in the 1960s is a big middle finger to black people who were struggling for their civil rights in that era, like putting the flags on the Capitol and that kind of thing. That was something specifically done to basically stick in somebody's eye and say, you know, up yours, more than anything else. And that was a horrible reaction to do. I'm glad that the state, long before this argument about flags, I'm glad that the state of Alabama took theirs down, I think back in the late 90s, because they saw that it was something that it was originally done out of spite. It was originally done specifically to try to insult and belittle and degrade a certain part of the population. And because of that, even if it was completely benign, and I don't have a problem with somebody liking the rebel flag, using it in decorations, because the vast majority of people that use it today use it specifically as a memento of Southern pride. To them, it's not a symbol of hate. They just do it because they like it, they think it looks cool, and they're proud to be from the South. But there were gestures like that, to put it on a public building, and to do so specifically to degrade a part of the population in that state. And that was wrong, and I'm glad we ended that practice. I'm glad that we ended it a long time before the PC police came in, because I would have hated to have thought that they had something to do with it. It was the right thing to do for it to be taken down, at least on official government buildings. I don't have a problem with people flying it on their own private property or anything like that. Heck, I lived right under the big rebel flag on the interstate. That was where I lived for a little while. It was right underneath that. Our property was butted right up against it. So I don't have a problem with that. I'm just saying that on an official government building, especially considering the historic context of it being put up in the civil rights movement in that era specifically to try to show solidarity with Jim Crow, there was a good reason for that gesture to be undone. It had no place beside our state flag and the American flag. And so there are certain traditions like that that I understand that people get offended about, and it's better to end them just because of the way that they came about, even if the tradition itself may seem kind of benign. So far as I could tell, and I did as much research as I could on this, I couldn't find out when Alabama first instituted Confederate Memorial Day. Maybe somebody out there has the research on it and could do a better job with this than I could. I couldn't find it. It doesn't seem like it was something that started in the 1960s. It seems like this is something that has been going on in the state for a very long time, and then just sort of got codified in officially into Alabama as a official state holiday. I couldn't find the exact date of when that was, and if somebody would be willing to look that up for me, if somebody could find it, because I looked and I couldn't find it. It doesn't seem as though this is one of those traditions that came about because of that. And because of that, I don't see it as really being something that is a big problem. But I did want to go over this one article with you. And it looks like I actually, it looks like I actually don't have the full article here. But anyway, so I'll just give you the long and short of it. There was an article that I saw not too long ago in the New Republic, and actually a buddy of mine was the one that referred it to me. He's somebody that's kind of moderate, somewhat left of center. And he was asking me, since it was Confederate Memorial Day the other day, what my thoughts were on it. And it essentially suggested that we turn the day that, and by the way, that happened last week, that it turn the day that General Lee surrendered to General Grant in Appomattox Courthouse, that we turned that into a national holiday that has celebrated the defeat of the Confederacy the same way that we celebrate VE Day, or the victories in other wars that we fought. And my immediate reaction to that was, it just seems vindictive. In the same way that we just went over how it was wrong for the individual states to try to basically give a middle finger to a part of their population, specifically black people that were fighting for the rights that were due them, and they were fighting for a just cause in the 1960s, just fighting to be treated as equals to white people. It was wrong for the states to do something specifically just to spite a particular group of its population. And especially based on the wording of this particular document, and it's an article from 2015, so it was a little while ago. You can look it up. It's on the New Republic. I'm sure you'll be able to find it with a quick Google search if you want to read the whole thing. But essentially, especially with the tone and the way that this was done, you could tell that it was nothing but pure, unadulterated spite. And to help people that may not necessarily be on one side of this debate or the other kind of understand what I'm talking about here. Let's say that you have a brother, and your brother and you got into this really huge fight at one point, something that just about ended your relationship, and you got to the point to where you had just about cut each other out of your lives completely, never saw each other again. That was something that you were contemplating. That's how bad this fight got. And eventually what happened is that you realized you were wrong. You realized that you had screwed up, and your brother won the fight. You came back, you reconciled. Even though it was tumultuous and difficult, you worked through it because you thought it was worth it to have a good relationship with your brother again. And eventually you got to a place where things were pretty good. Let's say that that's the scenario you're dealing with. How would you feel if your brother, even though you know that you messed up, you know that you were wrong, and your brother was on the right side of that debate? How would you feel if your brother celebrated the day that you came back and said that you were sorry and admitted defeat, and specifically referred to it as a victory day for yourself, that you were celebrating specifically in the way that you were, it was me winning that fight? Doesn't that seem incredibly vindictive to you? And so the reason that I think that on the opposite side of this, celebrating the defeat of the Confederacy is a really bad idea, one of the things that people forget is that President Lincoln, when this was resolved, was all about reconciliation. He wanted to make the transition back to unity as smooth as humanly possible. He wanted us to be one nation again, bring the South back in. There were a lot of people in the Republican Party, a lot of people that he even respected politically, that were suggesting that we punish the South and make it as hard on them as possible, and we make them pay reparations for all the cost and the war and everything. And Lincoln was saying, no. They're our countrymen. They're our brothers. Let's treat them that way. There's a certain level of mercy that Lincoln had that I think ought to be observed here. That while, even though it's pretty clear that the South was on the wrong side of this conflict, and even though it's pretty clear that while for some the fight wasn't about slavery, there were several that's specifically what it was about. There was a speech by Jefferson Davis's vice president that I remember in his inaugural speech, he specifically stated that the foundation of the Confederacy was on the right of a man to own another man. So there's no doubt that for some people in the Confederacy, they definitely believed in slavery and thought it was a good thing, and that is reprehensible and should never even be. It's so wrong to even contemplate that a just society would allow one man to be enslaved by another. But nonetheless, that's where you stand. That even though the South was wrong, that they completely screwed up, and that the North happened to be in the right of that fight, it would still be horribly vindictive and seemingly like something that you would do specifically to stir up strife and to anger certain people and sort of say, stick it to them by making the defeat a national holiday. Maybe I'm incorrect on that. Feel free to argue with me on that if you want to, but that's the way it seems to me. So finally, there was one other thing that was brought up in this article, and this is something that I know us in Alabama are specifically attuned to because there are so many Confederate monuments, so many Confederate memorials. I went to school not far from the Confederate Memorial Park. I mean, this is something that is a part of most Alabamians, if not daily life, certainly a part of their life that they see Confederate monuments, Confederate memorials. And so the haste to remove them has been something that has been incredibly problematic. In this same article in the New Republic that is suggesting that we ought to make the defeat of the Confederacy a national holiday, this same guy also argues that we should be getting rid of all Confederate monuments, which I know comes as no surprise considering his stance on the Confederacy. But one thing that he specifically points to, and remember this was written in 2015, just 4 years ago. So he specifically cited in this article that, there are going to be some people, and this is before Trump even announced his presidency, before the thing in Charlottesville happened with the neo-Nazis and the white nationalists and the alt-right, before all of that happened, he's saying that there are some people that suggest that if we get rid of the Confederate memorials and the Confederate monuments and get rid of Confederate Memorial Day, that what is going to happen next is there are going to be people that are seriously calling for the removal of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and anybody else in the American experience, in the American history archives that owned slaves, that we should be denouncing all of them and not studying them as heroes in history. And he essentially boils it down to say, but that's just insane. That will never happen. And you remember that I said exactly the same thing when all this talk about taking down Confederate memorials and Confederate monuments, for example, in New Orleans and in several other cities across the South and even in some places in the North, that all of this is going to lead to people saying that we shouldn't have any kind of memory of, and we shouldn't have anything that honors Washington and Jefferson and Thomas Jefferson. That was something that I predicted. And here he is in 2015, not that long ago, saying, oh, that's insane. Nobody, no matter how far left they are, is going to say that. Oh, really? Well, it's been a few years since then. Let's go ahead and I turn your attention to this. These are several different articles. You can look at them yourself. I'm not going to go through all of them, but these are all different occasions, different instances of not just random people, prominent people on the left, calling for the removal of Washington and Jefferson monuments. There's also, you can see down in the bottom left, change.org, that there are people that are trying to remove statues of Thomas Jefferson from a college campus. You remember that even though this one isn't listed, there was a movement to try to get George Washington taken out of George Washington University, and that he should no longer be the mascot, even though it's the university named after him. And so you're looking at all of this, and you can see that clearly he was wrong. That there were people that decided, yes, it is a good idea to get rid of Thomas Jefferson and George Washington because they owned slave owners. Therefore, we can't honor anything good that they did. We can't honor anything that they accomplished in life because they owned slavery. Now, I would tell you, and I've told you many times in the past, you can go look up the archive clips of me talking about this with Thomas Jefferson, with George Washington, about how they have been woefully mischaracterized as pro-slavery rights advocates, and they're not. Neither one of them are. They both believe that slavery should be done away with. And, you know, like I said, you can go and look up my research on that. But nonetheless, even if that weren't true, do we really want to get to a place to where a person is completely defined by one specific position that they took or one specific thing that they did, and then ignore all their other accomplishments? Ignore every good thing that they did in life. Because when I see monuments to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., I'm pretty sure that they're not honoring the fact that he was not all that good at fidelity. That he, you know, we have from the historical record, he had problems staying faithful. And I don't think that he's unworthy of honor because of that, even though that's a pretty significant sin, and it's an immoral practice for sure, that we should just ignore all the other amazing things that he did in his life. And so I'm not saying that we give excuse or we give cover for sin, but I'm also saying that even if that were true, even if all the horrible things that they attribute to Washington and Jefferson were actually true, which they're not, even if they were, do we really want to get to the point to where nothing that they did, nothing that the accomplishments of their life count because of the bad things that they did? When you're looking at any individual in history, you have to take the good and the bad. Just to use a biblical example really quickly, yes, David was an amazing king of Israel. He was the giant slayer. He was somebody that brought Israel to its highest point, somebody that is referred to as a man after God's own heart. Yet at one point he did kill a man so that he could take his wife, whom he had already slept with and impregnated. At one point he refused to enforce the law, even though that was his job as king, and that led to him being unseated by his own son. And so you have to remember that these people are human beings, and they made mistakes, and they did things, and they held beliefs that were untrue. I'm not saying that you ignore that or give that a pass. I'm just saying when we're looking at any historic figure, we would do well to remember that. We can honor them for the good things they did without full-on condoning every single action that they ever took in life. That being said, it looks like we're pretty close to out of time, so we're going to go ahead and go to the chaplain's report.
In 1775, the Continental Congress created the Chaplain Corps. Under the command of General George Washington, each soldier was required to attend worship service every Sunday. While other armies advanced on their feet, Washington's troops advanced on their knees. It's time for the Chaplain's Report with Caleb Colquitt on tactics.
Because of the attacks that happened in Sri Lanka, I thought it was appropriate to take a break from our series on Daniel and talk about some other things, specifically with Christians being persecuted. Now, to really understand this story, you do need to understand what's going on here. Peter, for preaching the gospel and doing the work of God, doing what Christ commanded him and the other apostles to do in the Great Commission, he has been imprisoned by King Herod. And so, despite doing everything he was supposed to do, despite loving God and loving Christ and wanting to do the best that he could to become a fearless warrior for the kingdom that we know he did become, he has been imprisoned for his beliefs. He has been persecuted for believing that Christ is the Son and preaching that word to other people. And this is not the first time. We see earlier in Acts 4, for example, he is beaten for this. And so he's somebody that is unfortunately accustomed now to seeing persecution for the cause of Christ. But at this point, he is locked up, and there is suspicion that he is going to be executed very quickly. The Bible says as much, that he's probably going to die in the morning. And yet, on that evening, before he is to be executed, he's suddenly released from captivity, miraculously. And I won't go into all the details because I want to specifically zero in on one aspect of this story, and that aspect is found right here in the book of Acts, chapter 12, verses 12 through 15. And it reads, "And when he realized this, he went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, who was also called Mark, where many were gathered together and were praying. When he knocked at the door of the gate, a servant girl named Rhoda came to answer. When she recognized Peter's voice, because of her joy, she did not open the gate, but ran in and announced that Peter was standing in front of the gate. They said to her, 'You are out of your mind,' but she kept insisting that it was so. They kept saying, 'It is an angel. It is his angel.'" Now, remember that since we're talking about Christian persecution, this is in the very early days of persecution. For a long time, the Jews were persecuting Christians, but the Romans hadn't really caught on, and Herod being sort of a puppet king of Rome, he's not somebody that was real concerned with this. But now, the day of Pentecost has already transpired, the church has finally been established here on earth, and a little bit of time has passed, and so this thing is starting to gain momentum. It is starting to really scare people in power. It is starting to really scare people that are in authority under the Roman government because their power is being challenged by people that follow a higher calling than they do. They follow a heavenly king more than they do an earthly king. They're not causing problems or riots or anything like that, but for people in authority, they do get really scared of spiritual people because those are people that cannot be so easily intimidated by threats of physical harm or their worldly authority being used against them. And that does terrify people in positions of authority. And so what you have here is Herod essentially being challenged by Peter, imprisons him, and is planning to put him to death, and yet Peter is released by God. And he comes to this home where people are praying for Peter, and because he's been imprisoned, his church family has gathered together to pray fervently for him. They've all met together specifically for this purpose. And this little slave girl, it says that she's so excited that she doesn't open the gate. I kind of imagine it that she is somebody obviously that is familiar with Peter because she recognizes the man's voice. That when she hears him, it's kind of those things where you get goofy or awkward on a date when you're really young or something like that, that even though it's a common sense thing, you just kind of lose yourself in the excitement that she is so thrilled, that she is so happy that Peter has come to her, that he is returned out of his imprisonment, that she runs in to inform the others, hey, Peter's here. Peter's back. He got out of prison somehow. And she's so sure of that. This little servant girl is going back to the people in there, the body of Christ, praying fervently for Peter, an apostle, to return to them. And when she does, she's met with this, not animosity per se, but a strong disbelief, saying that, oh, well, this is Peter's angel or Peter's ghost, or, and I guess maybe they thought he had already been executed, or that an angel bearing Peter's voice had come to them to speak to them, or something's going on. But whatever it is, they're sure it ain't Peter. They are convinced that Peter is not there because why? Peter is in jail under Herod's authority. I want you to think about that for a minute. These are Christians that have undergone persecution. These are Christians that are living in the first century. And yet, they're the ones that are convinced that their prayers are not working. They met together specifically to pray for Peter, and when their prayers are answered by God, they don't even believe that it's happening. I think that some of us in the church, and I've probably been guilty of this too, pray, but we don't really have faith that it's doing anything. Brothers and sisters, as somebody that has, in a very personal and effective way, experienced the good that prayer does, and I'm talking about specifically in my bout with cancer, that I had a recovery that just blew my doctor's minds, how fast I was able to get over it, and how little the chemo affected me. I don't have a shred of doubt anywhere in my mind that that was directly because I had so many people praying for me. And for those of you that are watching that did that, you have my eternal gratitude for that. But I think that even when we do pray for somebody that's sick, even when we do pray for somebody that is imprisoned or facing persecution, sometimes we as Christians don't even really believe that it's doing what it's supposed to. That we pray because we think that we should and we think it's the right thing to do and we told them that we were going to, but sometimes we pray thinking, okay, but it really doesn't change anything. And even after my battle with cancer and going through chemo and all that, there are even times where I find myself in that mindset. that I get to the point where I think, well, all I can do is pray, like that's not really going to do anything. Here's a Bible story of early Christians that had actually seen miracles happen with their own eyes and lived amongst the apostles, thoroughly unconvinced that their prayers are having any effect or that it is making any kind of change. And who is it that rushes in, that has a sure faith, that knows that it's Peter? A little servant girl. Now, we don't know this girl's age. I'm guessing probably a teenager or not far from it. But the point is that she goes in, and this is the person that has more faith than anybody else present. And I think maybe that's part of the reason that Christ calls us to have a childlike faith. The full maturity and wisdom of an adult, combined with that faith of a child that really believes that God makes a difference in their lives, that believes if they ask, they shall be given. And so this is a really strong, powerful faith that we can all model. Brothers and sisters, I encourage you to pray for the Christians in Sri Lanka and that are being persecuted the world over, both here in America, but in much more severe circumstances elsewhere in the world, in places like China where it's illegal to be a Christian, in places like the Middle East where they kill Christians on a regular basis. And don't you dare for a second think that it doesn't make a difference, because it does. Even when you may not necessarily feel like it makes a difference, it does. The Lord is hearing your prayers and he's answering just like he was here, just like he did with Peter and the group of Christians that assembled to pray for him. Even when you don't feel like your prayers are making a huge difference, don't think that way, because your prayers do make a difference. When you say thoughts and prayers heading your way, actually pray for that person and mean it, because your prayers do make a difference. Stay the course, friends.
Tactics is a production of News Radio 1440 and Cumulus Media Montgomery. Any opinions expressed on this program are those of the host and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of Cumulus Media. The theme song for Tactics is 6 Foot Town by Big and Rich. Graphics by Jessica Dawson. Broadcast studios provided by Cumulus Media Montgomery. Location studios provided by the Dalraida Church of Christ. Copyright 2019.